Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our online conference, which today will share some stories of Australian soldiers who fell after the guns went silent on the Western Front. My name is Rebecca Doyle, and I'm the director of the Sir John Monash Centre here in France. Before we start, just got a few notes for you. So for this Zoom platform, we're in a webinar format, which means your microphone and cameras are closed. To click on the historian slides, you'll have them in full screen. If you want to see the historian on full screen, just click on his little icon. By clicking on the question and answer tab at the bottom of the bar on the screen, you'll be able to ask your questions. Now, I encourage you and welcome you to ask your questions as we go through the conference. And at the end, there'll be a question and answer time with Pete to go through those. Any technical issues that you may encounter, these can be mentioned in the chat tab, and we'll try and get those addressed as soon as we can. So to host today's conference, I am pleased and delighted to welcome back Pete Smith, a local guide here on the Western Front, specialising in battlefields in northern France. Last time, in August, you will have met Pete for those that joined the conference on the Australian Olympians who also served in the First World War. So the topic that Pete has chosen to present to us today, as I mentioned, is Australian soldiers who sadly died in the days, weeks and months following the Armistice. I will say the content in some of the stories you'll hear does touch on mental health and suicide and other topics that some may find distressing. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to introduce you to Pete Smith.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the latest lecture from the Sir John Monash Centre at the Australian National Memorial. Australian soldiers that died after the Armistice. I'm sorry, darling, but I won't be coming home. These words were transcribed by a nurse as she tended a dying soldier during his final battle with influenza in late 1918. A piece of sound ranging film survives, graphically showing the sound waves generated during the last minute of the fighting. Mountainous highs reduced to flat lines as the guns fell silent at 11 o'clock on the 11th of November 1918. In the front line and the rest areas, men shook hands, patted each other on the back, and carried on with a myriad of tasks that soldiers carry out. It was just too much to take in for the Australians who had fought and survived years of frontline service. Just going to move the slides on. I have a terrible tendency to forget, so I'm going to try and remember this time. This lecture is about 7 of those soldiers who died after the Armistice. All but 2 can be found commemorated here in Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery and Memorial to the Australian Missing. So that's the reason that I picked those guys, is because you can actually come and visit their graves or memorials here at this site. To understand how and why soldiers continue to die beyond the Armistice, we need to briefly look at what they were doing as they waited to embark on the vessels which would take them home. The slide I've got up at the moment is just for unknown Australian soldiers. Don't even know what period that photograph was taken, but I just like it. It's a great image. So, repatriation. So what's that mean? The return of someone to his own country. The Armistice was a cessation of hostilities while the terms of the peace were negotiated. The signing of the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June in 1919 ended the war, the state of war between Germany and the Allied powers. The signing of the Armistice, these are just estimated figures, but 95,000 Australians were in France, 6,000 were in the UK, and 30,000 in the Middle East. I've actually noted figures of almost 200,000 Australians still awaiting to be repatriated. And perhaps this includes the clerical staff, volunteer workers, a myriad of other support agencies that were operating in the UK and elsewhere. The Gallipoli men would be the first to be repatriated. Many, in fact, were already on their way home, having taken Anzac leave, which was offered to the men who had left Australia in 1914. For the bulk of the men, a first-come, first-go system was favoured. Billy Hughes, the Australian Prime Minister, also decided that the criteria should include family responsibility and assured employment. In other words, key workers and family men being given priority. Didn't always happen, but that was the idea. He also insisted that Australian troops be repatriated as soon as the armistice was signed. That would mean that they're not going to move forward to occupy Germany, which many of the units fighting on the Western Front on the armistice did do. They followed up into Germany. Waiting to go home. What did the men do? It's an interesting question. What on earth did they do in that period? Perhaps the proverb, idle hands are the devil's workshop, would be appropriate here. As we can see, they didn't always do the right thing. So training, military training continued, but at a much more gentle pace. It was important that the men continued with their military training. Education, classes were organised teaching anything from English to ancient history. And men were given leave to expand their knowledge within their chosen professions or trades by working with or receiving training from UK companies, educational institutions, and then they could take their new ideas and experiences and qualifications back to Australia with them. First I'm showing here is just a generic picture of Australians loitering behind the lines and two little French children selling newspapers or broadsheets to them. Entertainment, so they needed to be entertained. So soldiers continued to produce concert parties, musical entertainment, as long as the manpower allowed. So here was an illustration of a concert party. Unfortunately, we don't know who they are or the unit that they serve with. Sport, men were encouraged to take part in all types of organised sporting competitions, many becoming international sporting spectacles with vast crowds watching AIF teams play English opposition. Should I mention the rugby here at the moment? No, I think we'll just quickly gloss over the rugby. So next picture is, on the next slide, Salvation Army. So religion. Most Christian organisations stepped up their efforts to offer accommodation and recreation for the servicemen with time on their hands. I often describe this as tea and dominoes. It's not always what every soldier wanted, as we will discover. But some did, and so tea and dominoes, a place to be warm, perhaps a little of the comfort of home. Health and the wounded, of course. Many men have felt physically and emotionally drained. The diseases of the trenches, lice, trench fever, had to be eradicated before they could be sent home. The wounded had to heal and be prepared for that voyage home. So rest camps were created where men could be cleaned up, both their equipment, their uniforms, and also themselves. So here we have again another generic picture of wounded Australians awaiting to go home. Now, I've always found this is quite an interesting on travel. So the men were given an opportunity to travel. You had to pay for it, but they were organised and subsidised outings. So they were helped by the government. They helped the payment. Trips organised to many of the friendly European capitals and to other locations. And many men took the opportunity to see a little more of the world, which moves nicely on to the next one: volunteering. Opportunities for more action. So there was the Russian intervention, which we're going to discuss in a little bit more detail later. And it's an attempt to help the White Russians fighting the Bolsheviks in Russia. And they were asking for volunteers. So the North Russian Expeditionary Force, of which only 3 officers and 6 sergeants were involved with that. The North Russian Relief Force, involving about 150 ranks. Many more expressed an interest. Up to 500 men expressed an interest in going on that, but eventually only around about 150 men were involved with the fighting in North Russia, and Dunster Force in Mesopotamia, and about 48 Australians involved with that. So if you wanted to continue, if you felt it was something that you wanted to do, perhaps we just say, who would do that? Who would want to do that? Well, potentially men who found they were good at their jobs in the military and wanted to continue it, or recent arrivals who hadn't seen any action and wanted to actually see a little bit more action. And of course, travel. Many men given an opportunity to go and see a little bit more of the world, then they would take it. Another very sad aspect: clearing the battlefields. The Australian Grave Detachments formed in the February of 1919. Their job is to exhume and to start to create the cemeteries that we all know on the Western Front, those rows of white headstones that we used to seeing the photographs of. And between the April and August of 1919, the exhumed and reburied over 5,500 men. And there were 11,000 men involved in that. So these are just a few of the locations where Australians continue to serve after the armistice. Perhaps at this point we also need to mention this, a great illustration that I tracked down: the Spanish influenza or Spanish flu. Why is it called Spanish flu? Well, perhaps I'll wait and receive some questions on that if anybody knows why it's called Spanish flu. If nobody does know, then we'll talk about it later. Where did it start? Well, interestingly, I would have said on the coast here in northern France. Large military hospitals, bad farming practices, mixes of people, all potentially causing a melting pot that could where the Spanish flu had started. We've now a lot more research has been done, and the first wave, which hit in the middle of April in 1918, has been chased back to an outbreak in a camp in Funston in Kansas, America. And that happened on the 4th of March in 1918. So we think it may have been brought to the Western Front by American troops arriving. It could have even started earlier than that. There are reported cases of something similar as early as the January of 1918 in America. So that's where we think it now started and was transferred to the Western Front. The first wave during the first quarter of 1918 caused no significant deaths, but the second wave certainly did. Significant being very, I suppose, very personal issue. If you're involved in the first wave and you catch it, then yeah, it's a little bit more personal. But the second wave towards the end of August lasted until December of 1918, and that one spread throughout the world, and October being the most deadly month of the pandemic. And the third wave hit Australia in the January of 1919, estimated that it's killed over 12,000 Australians. And the UK also experienced hundreds of thousands of deaths at the same time. Less deadly than the second, but considerably worse than the first. And then there was a fourth wave in the spring of 1920 as well. So let's move on now to the men themselves. Who are we going to be looking at? So now that we have an idea of some of the opportunities and problems facing the Australians as they kicked their heels and waited to return to their homes, let's look at the 7 men who, though surviving the war to end all wars, died. So I'm just going to name them all, and then we'll crack on with who they actually are and how they died. So driver William Henry Miles, sapper Herbert Hunter Long, driver Cuthbert John Stephen Anderson, Corporal Alfred Richard Andrew Arthur, Private William Joseph Tillerson, Captain Alan Brown, and Sergeant Samuel George Pierce, VC. So we're going to look at all of those men. So this is the photograph of the first. Now, I'm sorry, we haven't got photographs of quite a few of these guys. There just aren't photographs of them, unless somebody can track them down for me, but I couldn't find photographs. But in this case, driver William Henry Miles, serving in the 12th Brigade Australian Field Artillery. We have a picture of him. He died, and these are in date order of death. So I've listed these in date order of death. So he died on the 12th of November in 1918, and he died of bronchial pneumonia. and that was caused by the influenza, or as we now know it, the Spanish flu. His service file is exemplary and brief, and that's why it's brief, because it is exemplary. There's nothing in there that causes anything to be written in his service file. From arriving in France on the 10th of June 1916, he had only one period away from his unit, and that was leave to the UK. This indicates that he fought in most of the actions that his battery was involved in as an artilleryman during the time on the Western Front. But on the 2nd of November 1918, as we approach the Armistice, 11th of November, we can see he's not well. He's sent to the 41st Stationary Hospital at Dury with influenza. By the 7th of November, he has developed bronchial pneumonia. And on the 11th of November, at 11 a.m., as the bells of the Amiens Cathedral ring out in celebration, he is really poorly by then. And on the 12th of November, during the first full day of peace, at the age of 27, he dies. He was buried at Dury Hospital Military Cemetery, and this is a photograph of Dury Hospital. It's just outside of Amiens. It was an old mental asylum, in fact. So from the August 1918 to the January of 1919, this building was used intermittently by British medical units, and a cemetery was made next to the existing French military cemetery, because the French had also used it as a hospital. The cemetery will eventually contain the graves of 195 Canadians, 185 soldiers from the UK, 63 Australian soldiers, one man of the Cape Auxiliary Horse Transport Corps, so South African, one French and one American soldier. The problem was, as visitors had to pass through the grounds where the inmates of the asylum worked and exercised, this is obviously after the war, it was decided to exhume and to move those buried to a suitable Imperial War Graves cemetery. And that's, for the majority, that's here at Villers-Bretonneux. And his grave was concentrated at some point before 1927. It's not clear exactly when they were moved, but 1927 appears to be the final date when everybody had been moved to the various locations, predominantly here at Villers-Bretonneux in the cemetery here. His parents, Edwin and Mary Miles of Winiam, nil Victoria. You must excuse my pronunciation of both French names and Australian town names. It's not my forte. And they requested and possibly paid for a private epitaph on his headstone. The Lord gave and the Lord hath taken away. That's what we can find on his headstone here in the cemetery here. His trade on enlistment was agricultural labourer. Did his parents struggle on the farm after his death? They certainly would have struggled emotionally, as we do after the loss of a loved one. Perhaps their Methodist faith sustained them and offered some comfort. But his service file actually leaves us no further clues. So that's all we know about him. So I now move to our next soldier. So Sapper Herbert Hunter Long. We unfortunately don't have a photograph of him. 12 Field Company, Australian engineers, and he died on the 25th of November 1918, and sadly he committed suicide. So this is a very sad case. So 24-year-old Herbert Long enlisted on the 7th of January 1916, and previously he'd been working as a blacksmith in Malvern, Victoria. And as such, he made an ideal candidate for the Australian engineers. Obviously, they're looking for people that will fit into a trade in the military. And it's with the 12 Field Company that he will see most of his overseas service. On his attestation form is a section marked, and I noticed this and I find it very interesting, distinctive marks. And in view of what eventually occurred, perhaps scar right wrist and scar left wrist could, in hindsight, be an indicator of future actions. He arrived in France on the 11th of November 1916, joining the 12th Field Company Royal Australian Engineers on the 29th of November 1916. During that terrible winter of 16-17, the coldest for 40 years, it took its toll on him and on many of them in the trenches. And on the 9th of March 1917, he was evacuated with trench feet, very common at that period. And he will not rejoin his unit until the 30th of August, almost 6 months later. And that's a clear indication of the severity of his trench foot. In some cases, can be classed as a self-inflicted wound, but we won't go off on that tangent. As you know, I quite like my tangents. For those that listened to me lecturing before, that will definitely put me over my time. So, on the 5th of October 1918, having served predominantly with the 12th Field Company, he was sent on leave to the UK. And this is where we can see that things are not quite right. On his way to the UK, a comrade reported that he'd been sent to hospital from the rest camp in Boulogne. So this is as he's waiting for a boat. There's no comment in his service file as to why he was sent to hospital or the length of time he spent in the hospital. On the 20th of October, he's reported absent without leave. This is in the UK, in Britain, in London, in fact. And on the 9th of November at 8:45, he's apprehended at the YMCA hut, Young Men's Christian Association hut, Victoria Station, London, without a leave pass. He's charged with being absent from 6 a.m. on the 20th of October 1918 until when he was apprehended at 8:45 a.m. on the 9th of November. They're always very accurate on these dates and times for those that are absent without leave. And that's a period of 20 days, so it's not an inconsiderable period. He was remanded to his unit and released without prejudice after being put aboard the train for France the following morning. And again, we can see it's odd. So even though he's been absent for all that time, they just put him on a train and send him back. So we can assume that from now on, and it is an assumption, that he got back to his unit around the 11th of November, 1918. But there are no further records of the punishments or where he now is. So we have to just presume he's back with his unit. The next two entries on his service file are brief. 25th of November 1918, died of injuries. 26th of November 1918, admitted dead, Fort Fair Stationary Hospital. So the following are excerpts from the court of inquiry that took place because of his death. And it's described as a report on accidental or self-inflicted injuries. And this is from a medical case sheet and other documents. So Sapper H. Long was found shot at Ailey-sur-Somme. The Court of Inquiry finds that death was due to gunshot wound, there being insufficient evidence to prove how it was caused. Very, very odd sentence. And then later we get, this casualty should be reported as killed, self-inflicted. So let's have a look at his medical case sheet. This is rather horrific, so I'm not going to certainly read this out. Large open wound. The report goes on in great, rather horrific detail, but notes no evidence of cause, died of shot following the injury. Now, of course, there is evidence of cause. So again, it's a very strange comment. So this is an excerpt from the report of Acting Sergeant George Taylor, Military Foot Police. He's the man that actually finds the body. The body was lying with the head in a ditch. The greater portion of the face had been blown away, apparently caused by a rifle lying at his feet. On making an examination of the rifle, I found an empty cartridge in the breech and 5 live cartridges in the magazine. The sling of the rifle bore the stains of blood. And another officer reporting this, or an officer reporting this, Captain Learmouth stated, judging from the position of the body and the rifle, and in view of the fact that a tree nearby bears the stains of blood and pieces of flesh, in my opinion, this is a clear case of suicide. So we're getting this contradictory comments that he's not committing suicide. There's no evidence, and yet there very obviously is evidence. His parents, Gibson and Francis Long of Ethel Street, Malvern, Victoria, wrote on several occasions asking for further information about his death. In all of the letters they received the word suicide is absent. Did his parents ever find out he committed suicide? Well, there's nothing in the service file that indicates that they did. He's originally buried at Jury Hospital, and eventually again will be reinterred at the Villers-Bretonneux Military Cemetery. So his parents requested a private epitaph on his grave until the day breaks. And so let's just try and figure out what we know. So the conclusion. I think all the signs of a mind in turmoil are here. Erratic behaviour. Why was he admitted to the hospital during leave? Why did he go AWOL? Where was he staying for those 20 days when he was AWOL in London? And interestingly, there was found in his pocket in a green envelope a letter addressed to Mrs. W.O. Bulger of 5 Queen's Road, Peckham. There's no report of what was in that letter, which I'm sure would have hopefully shown some light on what was going on. So what was he doing on his return from leave when he was AWOL, and why was there no report of his transgressions in his service file? Did his mates or officers miss or ignore the signs? We'll never know. It's hard nowadays for us to identify those that committed suicide during the Great War, as it was generally covered up. I've seen figures quoted of an estimated 100 suicides in the Australian forces during the war. I'm sure that it could have been far, far higher. And after the Armistice, without the confusion of battle, it became more difficult to conceal. So the question is, why was it concealed? And so I'm going to offer a few suggestions. Morale. Wouldn't have been good for morale, knowing that men were killing themselves. Bringing the army into disrepute. Again, are we not looking after our soldiers, that they're committing suicide? And then pensions. Is there an element of benevolence? Because unfortunately, a soldier that committed suicide, his relatives did not receive a pension. So it could be any of those. He's commemorated back in Australia, in Malvern. Stonington, Victoria, I think that's how you pronounce it, and he's one of 198 commemorated on their memorial in the St George's Church of England. So we can see the big bronze memorial there. So we'll now move on to, from that very sad, well, they're all sad stories really, I suppose, now move on to the next soldier. So this is Driver Cuthbert John Stephen Anderson. He's 17th Battalion Australian Infantry, so he's an infantryman. He died on the 29th of November 1918, and he's dying again, sadly, of influenza, Spanish flu. Born in Scone, New South Wales, before enlisting, he worked as a stockman and boundary rider. And on the 3rd of February, he enlisted in the 17th Battalion Australian Imperial Force, so he's an infantryman. A married man. Wife Sylvia and a baby Albert, aged just 1 year a year old, and they're living at 56 George Street in St Peter's, Sydney. Now it's interesting, isn't it? So he's a stockman, but they're living in the city. So I would presume that she would move there when he enlisted and left to go off to the war, and bringing the family closer together, because that's also where his parents were living, Jesse and Philip Cuthbert Anderson, and his father was a clerk in Holy Orders. So I think that what's happened is the family's moved closer to his parents. 17th Battalion was raised in New South Wales, Liverpool, as part of the 5th Brigade and the 2nd Division, and they landed at Anzac Cove. So this soldier is an Anzac. And he landed on the 20th of August in 1915 and took part in the tough fighting to take Hill 60 during the August offensive on the peninsula. And on the 18th of September, he was admitted to hospital with dysentery and evacuated to St George's Hospital, Malta, as many were, with the old stomach problems from the peninsula. Rejoined his battalion in France, appointed driver. So he becomes a first line transportman. So in other words, he's looking after the field cookers, the animals that are pulling the field cookers, the supplies, ammunition, etc. So it's a job that obviously would have been given to him because of his background of working with animals, and this would almost certainly save his life during the fighting, because he would have remained with the transport section of the battalion during most of the major battles. That's an assumption. We don't know for certain, but generally speaking, transport men tended to have a greater rate of survival during the war. And he served in this capacity to the signing of the Armistice. But on the 18th of November in 1918, he reports sick to the 5th Field Ambulance, and 2 days later he's transferred to the 41st Stationary Hospital Drury. Well, sadly, you know what's coming next. So a letter from the commanding officer in the hospital explained his last days. Admitted to hospital on the 20th of November 1918, suffering from influenza. The disability of admission was of a serious nature, with bronchopneumonia supervening on the 22nd of November, and his condition became very dangerous, death finally taking place on the 29th of November. Again, buried in Jury Hospital Military Cemetery, and again moved. We can see his grave here at Villers-Bretonneux in the military cemetery. His wife picked an epitaph for him: "Not lost, but gone before." sad aspects of this are to do with the belongings of these soldiers. They're trying to get the belongings home, and we can see that Sylvie, his wife, several times in 1919 inquired about his personal effects, and very specifically his diary and pocketbook, which she knew he'd been keeping. And she also asked for a photo of his grave, which will be forthcoming, but sadly his diary and pocketbook did not ever get home. And again, there's a sad little endnote, and I found this very moving when I read this. When he was 9 years old, his son Albert was sent to the post office to collect his father's memorial plaque. Now, a memorial plaque is a fairly considerable lump of bronze, and I just found that just terrible. At 9 years old, that he went to go and collect his father's memorial plaque, and it just states his mother being unable to attend. So we'll move on to the next chap. Corporal Alfred Richard Andrew Arthur. Now, sadly, again, we have no photograph of him. He was serving at his death with something called the Australian Employment Company. Now, I have to say, a new unit, and we'll explain a little more about them later on. And he died on the 14th of December in 1918, and he lost his life in an accidental death, so it's an accident, but very unusually his body is missing, and for the reasons which will become apparent. So he enlisted in the 15th Australian Army Service Corps, and he was posted as a field baker. Now that would make sense really, because that's exactly what he did in civilian life. He was a baker. The photo I'm just showing up, the slide I'm showing now, it's a British field bakery, but you get the gist of what they're doing. I think these are called proving bins, these big bins that you can see there for proving bread. But that is the type of work he would have been doing, working as a field baker. He arrived in Alexandria on the 22nd of October 1915, and he then moved to France, serving with the 2nd Australian Field Bakery. But a few of you have heard of that unit. So most of his time, most of his service, he was nearer to the coast. So Calais, Etaples, both appear in his service file, and he's a field baker. So again, one of the forgotten thousands of men who kept the wheels turning in this massive military machine. On the 29th of October 1918, he travelled to the UK on leave, and returning on the 12th of November, the day after the Armistice. At this point, or perhaps slightly earlier, he was transferred to the Australian Employment Company, and that's where he's going to serve. And they basically are doing all sorts of jobs in the rear areas. And he's serving at Australian Corps headquarters. I suspect he was still baking, but there's no way we can know for certain. And they're in the area of Picquigny, that's not how you pronounce it, northwest of Amiens. On the 14th of December 1918, he was cycling back from an evening out at, and now it's described in his service file, of Moulin Bleu. So, and the spelling is very bizarre. So it's the Moulin Bleu, so the blue windmill. And I would guess, and I'm only guessing, but I think it's got to be a bar, or even perhaps something a little more. And I think we can say with some certainty that alcohol had been consumed. Let's read the final report. So this is from the Australian Red Cross Wounded and Missing Inquiry Bureau files, and it's the statement of Private G.R. Drysdale, who was also working in the Australian Employment Company. On the night of the 14th inst, while cycling home with Corporal Andrew Arthur from Moulins Bleu, I stopped to light my lamp and fit my front wheel. I got on my bicycle and tried to overtake my friend, but meeting a sentry, I asked him, had he seen my friend? And he said he had just heard a big splash and thought it must have been my friend falling into the river. I immediately undressed and searched the river, but could find no trace of him. The sentry alarmed the guard, and we had a further search, but were unsuccessful. The next morning, while dragging the river, they found his bicycle, but no trace of him. And then we have the report of this, the guard that was in the Garrison Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, British unit. On the night of the 14th inst, whilst on duty guarding the bridge which spans the canal at about 9:45 p.m, I was standing on the far side of our number 3 bridge. I've tried to find out where number 3 bridge is and I can't find it. Anyway, when I heard a loud splash in the water, me thinking that somebody had fallen into the canal, hurried to the spot where I thought the accident had occurred, and on arriving there, an Australian soldier came riding up on the bicycle and asked me if I'd seen his friend. I then told him that I believed that someone had fallen into the canal. He took off his clothing and started to search the canal. I immediately alarmed the guard, who then searched along the canal but could not find a trace of anybody. The bicycle was found the following morning near number 3 bridge. So we also get the opinion of the general officer commanding the brigade. Death accidental, probably drowned, had leave for the evening, not to blame, nor was any other person. So fairly straightforward. Very sadly, he fell in the river with his bike and drowned, and then presumably was washed out to sea with the river, but his body never being found. His wife, Nora, who was living at 24 Young Street, Parkside, South Australia, would have received the news by telegram in the days or weeks following the accident, and one can only imagine the heartbreak. Because his body could not be found, he will eventually be commemorated on the Australian National Memorial here at Villers-Bretonneux, and it carries the names of all of those Australians who are missing in France and some at sea, I have to say. And the slide I just put up, a great slide, shows the construction of it. So this is the construction of the Australian National Memorial, including that memorial to the missing that his name is now on. He's only one of 3 men who died in France as members of the Australian Employment Company. All 3 died, sadly, after the war. The final end note concerns his wife Nora's search for his belongings again. None of the belongings reached home. Normally, they would have been sent in a sealed package, but nothing in his service file indicates this occurred, and Nora will be left to mourn without even that last comfort of something that was with him. This is where he's commemorated. He's commemorated on the Roll of Honour Orroroo. Did I say that right? I hope I did. Public school, and we can see that here. So I'm sure I'm running behind time, so I'm going to move on very quickly to the next soldier, Private William Willie Joseph Tillerson, very obviously called Willie, as we will see by his parents. And he's in the Anzac Provost Corps, and he sadly died on the 23rd of December 1918, and it's another accidental death. So Willie Tillerson was 29 years old and a draper living in Armadale, Victoria, and his father had emigrated from Nowtherham in Calderdale, West Yorkshire. So if you're wondering what that's like, think of Last of the Summer Wine and Satanic Mills, and you'll get an idea of where the family came from. He enlisted on the 1st of March 1915 into D Company of the 23rd Battalion. They're part of the 6th Brigade 2nd Division. So he's another Gallipoli veteran. Landed at Anzac Cove on the 30th of August and spent the whole time holding the line at Lone Pine, rotating in and out with the 24th Battalion. So a tough time, but shortish. On the 8th of December, he's evacuated and suffering from bronchitis. Interestingly, the ship is evacuated on was called the Grand Tully Castle. And for those that are interested in war poets, Rupert Brooke, the poet, fell ill on board this ship just before he died. He's eventually discharged from hospital and transferred to the Anzac Police Corps in Abbassia, Egypt, on the 3rd of April 1916. So he leaves the infantry and enters the military police, the police corps. On 3rd of August, he embarks for the UK. And during this time, he finds himself in hospital a couple of times. And one of those times was for the soldier's disease, VD. So he actually caught a sexually transmitted disease at that time. He's then transferred to France after having been in England for some time, to the Corps headquarters on the 14th of July, 1918. And he's working in the Field Punishment Compound. I'll leave that for a question for somebody to ask me about field punishment, what that actually means. And on the 10th of October, his last position is noticed as the Safe Custody Compound, so he's working in another compound. So it's all about prisoners, and these are not German prisoners. These are soldiers who are under guard for whatever misdemeanor. On the 23rd of December in 1918, so this is obviously after the war, and just almost on Christmas Eve, is granted leave to visit Amiens. And about 8:30 p.m. on that evening, he's admitted to the 41st Stationary Hospital in a dying condition. And he'd been accidentally run over by a lorry. He died at 9 p.m, an hour after he had the admission on the 23rd of December from abdominal injuries and a fractured spine. So here's a report sent to his mother, and this is from the chaplain, C. Miller, who was attached to the 41st Stationary Hospital, and very often the chaplains would write to the parents. Dear Madam, you will have heard by now the sad news of Private J. Tillerson's death in this hospital yesterday. I am very sorry that I was not informed in time to see him before he died, which is about half an hour after being admitted here. I gather that he was conscious when brought in and did not suffer very much pain, as is often the case with such severe injuries. We laid his body to rest today in the quiet military cemetery attached to this hospital, which is on the Amiens Drury Road. And as we know, of course, he's going to be exhumed and moved with a Church of England service. It only remains for me to express my sincere sympathy with you in your bereavement and to pray that our Heavenly Father, who alone can do it, may comfort and strengthen you. Believe me, yours sincerely. There's another letter from the matron, M.W. Bannister, of that 41st Stationary Hospital. Dear Mrs. Tillerson, I'm very sorry to tell you that Private J. Tillerson, number 849, Australian Provost Corps, was admitted into this hospital last night seriously injured, the result of an accident, and he died at 9 p.m. He did not leave any message. He will be in a little cemetery quite close to the hospital. Any personal belongings he had will be forwarded to you through the usual channels as soon as possible. Please accept my deepest sympathy. Yours sincerely. So just to add a little bit to this, here's a slide showing the road just running past the hospital with Amiens Cathedral in the middle distance through the trees. So his mother again picked out an epitaph to be placed on his grave in memory of our dear son Willie, thy will be done. So that's how we know that he was called Willie. His meagre belongings were sent home to his mother in 1919. Amongst them, the 2 A's worn on his uniform to denote service in Gallipoli. Those are 2 little brass A's that the soldiers wore on their shoulders, followed by 6 photos of his grave requested by his mother in the April of 1920. So as you can imagine, the family were not overly impressed with the lack of detail of how he died. So during the 1919 and 1920, much correspondence took place between the family in both Britain and Australia as to what had exactly happened to Willie. And interestingly, I can find no account of the actual accident. And so you have to ask, how did a 5'9" healthy man fall under a lorry? Drink, possibly. I think drink would certainly have been consumed. But perhaps if you were of a suspicious nature, something more sinister. You have to remember his job was not one that the criminal element in the army would appreciate as a military policeman. So it's just a thought. I'll just put that thought in your head. Again, he's commemorated back in Australia on a Roll of Honour, and this one is at St Albans Anglican Church in Armadale, Victoria. And in fact, right into the 1960s, he was still remembered. And I like this fact that he's remembered by his sister because as the next of kin, she applied for the Gallipoli Medallion being offered by the Australian government to the veterans and families of those who served at Gallipoli. So he was still remembered well into the 60s. And of course, he's remembered by others visiting the cemetery and hopefully by all of you now. But interesting and very sad little story. So moving on again. Now we get to 2 chaps who are not buried in the cemetery, here. Captain Alan Brown, 49th Battalion Australian Infantry, and he died on the 20th of July in 1919, and he was murdered. Now, you may not agree he was murdered. Anyway, we'll tell the story. Let's decide whether we think he was murdered or was killed in action by looking at his story. So he's a fascinating chap, I have to say. Pre-war, Alan Brown this is his pre-war story. Born in 1891 in Manchester, England, the son of Alfred and Margaret Brown, and it's Old Trafford. As many of you, if you're football fans, will know that name in Manchester. His father was a fish, game and poultry dealer, and he was educated at Manchester Secondary School. He already had seen some military service. He served in the Duke of Lancaster's own yeomanry for 3 years. It must have been a young chap when he was serving. That's a territorial unit, cavalry, so mounted yeomanry. And he travelled with the family when he was 21 years old not with a family, sorry, he didn't travel with a family. He travelled by himself when he was 21 years old and became a farmer in Brisbane. So hadn't been there long before the war kicks off, and so he enlists in the AIF on the 25th of August 1914 as a private in the 2nd Australian Light Horse. Severely wounded in the foot at Gallipoli on the 14th of July while serving with the 1st Brigade, and he returned to the Peninsula on the 20th of October 1915 and continued to serve with the 2nd Light Horse after the evacuation in Egypt as well. At some point, he obviously was spotted that this is a man that would be suitable for a commission. So he was ordered to France to receive a commission, and that would involve his training for that commission as well, which is necessary. And he received his commission on the 8th of February in 1917, and then joined the 49th Battalion as an infantry officer. Promoted to a lieutenant on the 14th of July 1917. And he was wounded for a second time here in the hip and elbow on the 15th of July in the Messines sector. So not actually, it's after the Battle of Messines, but very badly in the elbow. And once it was healed, that restricted the movement of his arm. So he was placed on a supernumerary list and posted to the 3rd Convalescent Depot. So in other words, they're kind of deciding he's got to go to training rather than active service. He's not up to active service anymore. But oddly, on the 7th of June 1918, he was selected for special duty with the Imperial Army, serving with the Alert Force, which is one of those units that's going to be sent to Russia. So 3 officers and 6 sergeants will be sent to Russia. He was mentioned in dispatches twice whilst in Russia, 24th of March 1919 and 11th of November 1919, and he was awarded the Bronze Oak Leaf and Order of St. Anne with Swords 3rd Class and the Order of St. Stanislas with Swords 3rd Class for conspicuous services rendered to Russia. Now, sadly, he's not going to get these awards. Literally, he's not going to get them because with the demise of the Imperial Russian Army and the White Russians, those awards, the medals were not forthcoming. So even though he's been awarded them, I don't think he ever received the medals, or his family didn't receive them, because sadly, he was killed. And I put in brackets here, murdered, when his soldiers mutinied and went over to the Bolsheviks on the 20th of July 1919. He was only 28 years old. So we have a report, and possibly becoming one of the last serving AIF soldiers to be killed in action, because he was still classed as serving with the AIF. So the Brisbane Courier reported on the 2nd of September 1920, the late Captain Alan Brown enlisted in Brisbane with the AIF and was murdered by mutineers in Russia. The London Daily Telegraph of October the 23rd, 1919 says, the fate of many British officers is not clear. That of Major Hay of the Royal Scots, unhappily, is almost certain that a number of mutineers from Kalesh, unpronounceable Russian name, where the major was stationed, state that he was shot defending himself, and others that he and the Russian officers with him made a stand, all eventually using their last bullet on themselves. At the same place, and this is the report that we're looking for, at the same place was another British officer, Captain Brown of the Australian Imperial Force. This officer arrived in the lines and found the sentries sitting down smoking and arguing. Through his interpreter, he ordered them to stand up and not to play the fool. They replied in English, "Finish the officer," and tried to arrest him. Alone, among these scores of armed hostile men, Captain Brown replied with the promptness and unshakable courage of the typical British officer. He shot 2 men dead and wounded a 3rd before being shot and bayoneted to death. Any friends in Queensland of the late Captain Brown are invited to communicate with his father, Mr. Alfred Brown, 1 Pomona Docks, Manchester. He's commemorated at the Archangel Allied Cemetery on a special memorial known as the Kipling Memorial. In other words, his body is not there. He's buried at Kleshovo Cemetery. He was previously, and this is interesting, he was previously named on the Brookwood Russian Memorial, which had been erected in 1983. This is just outside of London. Brookwood's a big civil and military cemetery. But that was dismantled in 2015, and dismantled because it was thought that now we can go to Russia quite safely and there's no problems. You can actually go and see his memorial in Russia, so there doesn't need to be one in the UK. Here's a photo of that memorial. Sorry, no, he's not a photo of that memorial. Must concentrate. It's commemorated on the Digsmart House Australian Hospital Memorial in St John's, Digsmart. Now, a fascinating little story, this. I've not seen this memorial before, and here we can see a photo of that memorial. So during World War One, many Australian officers were injured in France, who had been injured, wounded in France, were brought to this house to recuperate. And so it's an auxiliary hospital. And following the recovery and period of convalescence, they were often sent back to the front. And so they're all listed on this memorial, 73 of whom were subsequently killed. And so the names are commemorated on a marble tablet inside of St. George's Church in Digswall. And in fact, the marble came from Australia. So an interesting little story in its own right. And now, moving on again, we have the final story. Excuse me. We have the final story, Sergeant Samuel John Pearce, VC and MM, 45th Battalion of Royal Fusiliers. And we can see a nice photo of him here. Killed in action on the 29th of August, 1919. So again, he's going to be with the Russian intervention. He was born in Wales, Penarth, in 1897, and came with his family to Australia in 1911, where the family settled near Mildura, Victoria. He served for 2 years in the local militia, again, before enlisting in the Australian Imperial Force, sailing as a reinforcement draft for the 7th Battalion. Saw brief action in Gallipoli, so yet another Gallipoli man, spending only a few days in the line prior to evacuation. Then transferred to the 2nd Machine Gun Company, and he remained with them as they transferred to the Western Front. Awarded the MM for services near Glencorse Wood on the 18th of September 1917. That's on the salient, very close to Polygon Wood. Wounded in action on the 19th of May in 1918, and after recovering in the UK, he was sent for further machine gun training, and he joined the 1st Machine Gun Battalion. It's during this period that he had become engaged and later married to an ambulance driver, Kitty Knox, who then fell pregnant. So the war had ended with the signing of the Armistice, and Samuel became attracted to the idea of a period of further service whilst awaiting for the arrival of his child. He didn't want to travel back to Australia with his wife pregnant, because that was the whole idea, they were going back to Australia. And so, like many others, he volunteered to join the North Russian Relief Force. To do so, he was discharged from the AIF, because by now Australia has decided that it doesn't want any of its soldiers to go there. But if you were discharged from the AIF and then enlisted into the British Army, and he joins the 45th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers, he is immediately promoted to sergeant, or joining them, which he would be, as a battle-hardened veteran. He's promoted to a sergeant. So I'm going to read an excerpt of his Gazette. This is in the London Gazette, and it's his bravery citation. For most conspicuous bravery, devotion to duty, and self-sacrifice during the operations against the enemy battery positions north of Emtsu, North Russia. Sorry, I'm reading this. Emsa, not Emtsu, Emsa. On the 29th of August, 1919, Sergeant Pearce cut his way through the enemy barbed wire under very heavy machine gun and rifle fire, and cleared a way for the troops to enter the battery position. Seeing that a blockhouse was harassing our advance and causing us casualties, he charged the blockhouse single-handedly, killing the occupants with bombs. This gallant non-commissioned officer met his death a minute later, and it was due to him that the position was carried with so few casualties. His magnificent bravery and utter disregard for personal danger won for him the admiration of all troops. He was just 22. Victoria Catherine Sarah Pearce was born after Samuel's death, and the Victoria is obviously a reference to the Victoria Cross. Both mother and daughter did emigrate to Australia in the May of 1920. So this is very interesting. This is a photo of his grave taken in Russia. So we can see that here, and this is commemorated in Archangel Allied Cemetery, and he's got a special memorial, a Kipling memorial, so he's not actually in that cemetery, in the Archangel Allied Cemetery. He's buried at Bozos, here we go, Obozerskaya burial ground. Now, interestingly, that burial ground is lost. We actually don't know where it is, or do we? I'll just carry on. He's also commemorated in Mildura as well, so we can see the statue to him. And he's remembered in Wales as well. In Penarth in Wales, there's also a memorial to him there. So let's get to the interesting little aspect of this. In 2018, a body was found by a team of Russian volunteers. Now, it's not accidental. These guys had been searching for his body for a long, long time. You can, if you find it on YouTube, there's a report on the ABC News, which also includes his grandson, who was also there, Richard Christen. It was shown in 2019, where they've actually almost certain, his grandson, 99% certain, was his body. He's recovered, the bones were washed. It was found that he was missing a toe. He'd lost a toe on the Western Front. A slouch hat was found in the grave. And at that time, they were awaiting DNA analysis. Well, oddly, I suspect they're still awaiting DNA analysis, because I've tried to find any further information about what has happened with this body that was recovered, and I can find nothing. So I'll leave it up to you guys out there, see if you can track down something else. But as far as I'm aware, no sign of him. So that brings us to the end of the guys that I picked. So I now think we're going to go to a period of questions and answers.
Thank you, Pete. Very interesting stories. I really appreciate you guiding us through those 7 different stories that really fell at what was really quite a difficult time. And I think what we look at when we think of the Armistice is this almost palpable feeling of jubilation that existed worldwide. But, in the reality of what did that mean for the soldiers? How did they feel during the Armistice? And Louise has put a comment in the Q&A sort of with regards to going back to Sapper Long, who sadly did commit suicide, is wondering too what the soldiers were thinking about the burden that they may be on their families when they return. And I think that mental health. The Armistice didn't take away the horrors of the war and the traumas that they saw, and I think there's a really quite interesting component around that.
Yeah, I agree entirely, and I think there's the suicide aspects. Not enough being really research being done, and really one of the reasons why there's not the amount of research that you'd like to see is because it is quite difficult to identify men during periods of combat who committed suicide, and certainly as we get towards the end of the war, when they're realizing that they are going to have to take their troubles home with them, and do they want to take those home with them? Would it not be better for the family to receive a pension? As it's horrific just thinking about it. I mean, it still exists. Sadly today as well. Would it not be better for the family to receive a pension? And the only way they can receive that is if they commit suicide without it being obviously suicide. And you can certainly see there's an effort taking place here with his death, where they are definitely trying to not call it suicide when it absolutely is.
Mm-hmm. I think too, I suspect, having survived the war and, thousands of soldiers at the signing of the Armistice would have effectively disappeared. And in the end, perhaps they were just claimed missing, presumed dead, that there was just no trace of them too. And I suspect that we might find that as well, that they did just disappear.
Yeah, but we do. And in fact, we found that a lot of men disappeared. A lot of men deserted and decided, since they were here in the UK, and this is a subject for another whole lecture, I think, but decided that whilst they were here in the UK, they didn't want to go back to Australia. They wanted to travel. They wanted to see more of the world. But again, I think we can fairly much, I suppose, guess with a lot of them that these are men that need time to travel, need time to come to terms with what's happened with them. And one of the things I've noticed on several service files, you'll get mothers or wives asking when their relatives are going to be released from the military. And we can see from the service file that they were released months before that request comes in. And what it is, basically, they've got back to Australia and they've gone walkabout. They're not going home. They're going walkabout. They've got money in their pockets. But I think it's a cathartic kind of action. They want to talk about it with other mates and do something different before they go back and become embedded with their families again.
I think, and I think about how they would have felt when that armistice was called. Would it be relief? Would they just be exhausted? Would they find that hard to separate from that mateship and that family they've been involved in? And I think it's probably almost impossible for the soldiers to untangle those emotions in their head. And I think the other part of it is that many of them, due to the realities of the war that was surrounding them, and probably partly that mental health factor that they needed to put in for survival, is they probably didn't think they were ever going to see the end of a war. And I think you put yourself in that mindset that they didn't think that was ever going to happen. So then how you process that.
Yep, I agree entirely, and hence when we were talking about what did the soldiers in the that were in the front line do at the ending of the war, and it's not at all what we would expect. We expect parties, big parties, and the men just didn't do that. There were big parties taking place in Paris and London and elsewhere, but the men that were near the front line or in the front line, it was almost an element of, well, what do I do now? What's happening with the rest of my life? Because they hadn't thought about what was going to happen with the rest of their life. There was no perception that there would be a rest of their life almost.
That's right. And I think, that period of time, there was also for some, an incredibly long wait until they could return to Australia. The majority of them didn't get back till sort of 1919, and some of them had to wait until they were well enough to travel as well, and then taking the ships back home, that's also quite a long duration. And on that, we've got a question from Graham just around how many deaths there were in transit, sort of that repatriation period back to Australia and in around Europe. Do you have some more information on that the hospital ship portion?
Yeah. Great question, Graham. No idea. I'm afraid. I don't know. I haven't ever seen it broken down into the number that die on board ship. And of course, there were suicides on board ship. I've read accounts. We know that men leapt over the side. So there were suicides on board. Obviously, there would still be some of the more severely wounded, or perhaps were in a condition where it was thought that they were well enough to travel, sadly would die on board the ship as they returned. We also know there was some accidents. Some of the ships ran into mines, because remember, the mines are still floating about, and so there were accidents. Some of the ships, there were accidental deaths, again by military action, you could say, after the signing of the armistice. So the simple answer is I have no idea, but it's an interesting research project to find out how many did die on that journey home.
Yeah, I know. For me, having a bit of a look through, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintain quite a detailed record online that people can access. And looking for me, I looked at the period sort of from 12th of November to 30th of November. So just a 2.5 week period post the armistice. There were, of all Commonwealth nations, just over 11,000 deaths.
Yes, it is truly horrific. I mean, there's some truly just ludicrous deaths. I remember one I read many years ago was men in bunk beds, and it was a multiple tier bunk bed, and it collapsed and it killed men. And you're thinking, dying in a bunk bed, having survived the war.
It's quite traumatic. And looking, just now digging a little bit further into the Commonwealth War Graves Commission website, that 2.5 week period, 277 were Australians in that sort of 2 week period. If you then extended that through until just say the 30th of June of the following year, there were almost 1,500 Australians in that time.
Yep.
Just under 400 commemorated in France, so sort of in Albertville, around where the hospitals were. A lot of them then are actually commemorated in Australian cemeteries.
Yeah.
So there's that portion of on the military ships, and then still unwell, still suffering the severity of their injuries.
I think a lot of these, if you look at them individually, I'm sure you'll find Spanish flu raising its head over and over again. The Spanish flu epidemic was truly, I mean, it's very relevant to today, but it was truly extraordinary. They keep putting up the figures. 50 million plus is now the figure. Well, a few years ago, I was saying half of that, but we keep upping the figures of how many people we think died of Spanish flu in those 3-4 phases of it. So it was a terrible pandemic, and one that we shouldn't really underestimate the casualties or the people that died during that period from the Spanish flu.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a couple of comments here, just looking at the age of some of these young men as well.
Yeah.
And Mark's made a comment of Samuel Pearce being 22 when he died, and having served in Gallipoli, that the age that he would have enlisted at as well. Louise has also made a comment of a great uncle who enlisted in 1915, and coming home in 1919, was 21 after enlisting, and there's really young lives lost.
Yeah, hi Louise. Yes, indeed, those lives of the young men, those are the ones that we tend to concentrate on, and we can't help it because it is I suppose it's just we look at the young and think, oh, how sad they had their whole lives ahead of them. And yeah, we can see from that very clearly that these guys are enlisting underage. It's just not uncommon at all, no, for guys to enlist underage. But I always find it quite interesting. The older guys, there are older guys amongst these. And I, in my research, and one day I may write this story down, I've just come across a 64-year-old. So he actually won't survive the war. He dies. But he was 64 years old. And so God knows what. Well, I do know what age he said he halved his age to join. So it is extraordinary. The age thing is a very interesting. There's lots of work we could do on that. But yeah, a lot of these guys were still young men when they sadly succumbed after the war.
Mm. A question coming in here from Jason, and I did notice on the slide for Samuel piece of the spelling of sergeant. So Jason has acknowledged when he's visited the Western Front of noticing there is a Q, there is a J. Do you have any history behind that one?
I do. Why I'm laughing is because it's something that I do tend to point out when I'm on within the cemeteries, and so I did spell it. I think the J way with a J rather than a G. It's a very, very long story, so I'm going to have to massively abbreviate it. Some units spelt with a J, but during the First World War, some did not. So, example, Royal Marines always spelling with a G. I think the Royal Flying Corps also spelt with a G. The Australian AIF generally spelt with a J. There is no official change from the spelling of J to a G, and effectively you could say that the J spelling is a French spelling of sergeant and the G spelling is a German spelling of sergeant. So why we would change from roughly the French spelling to the German spelling just after the First World War, who knows? But there is no, and there never was, an official kind of document that says we will now spell sergeant with a G. So you get it spelt both ways. Interestingly, the Commonwealth War Graves, as they replace headstones of soldiers that were once spelt with a J, now spell it with a G. So you get the mix. So you can see graves side by side, both sergeants, but different spelling. So yeah, it's an interesting one that you'll never get to the bottom of if you try to find out exactly what happened.
Well, then that was a very good question, Jason.
It was.
We got a nice comment here from Mark, commenting that for Sapalong, who did commit suicide, that he's remembered on a memorial, and that often cannot be the case. And so the fact that he is allowed to have that recognition is quite important.
It is. It's one of the things that I forgot, really. And I'm going to go off on another little tangent here. Never mind suicide, but how about the guys that were executed in the British Army for a variety of reasons? Should they be on memorials as well? And lots of debate over the years and lots of controversy over the years. And there's a very famous case of a village war memorial, where it's a village that the landed gentry, the lord of the manor, his son was killed, and he is going to pay for the building of this memorial, commemorating all those that left this little village and went off to war and did not return. But he doesn't want, within the village, there is a man that was executed for cowardice, effectively, and he doesn't want this name on a memorial where his son is also going to be named. And so effectively, until just recently, that village didn't have a war memorial because he would not allow the war memorial to be built with what he viewed, the father of this officer, with the name of a coward on the memorial. And it's only in fairly recent years that everybody got together and said, look, this is ridiculous. And everybody's name is now on the memorial, and the memorial was built. But it took a long time.
Thank you. Another question coming in here. Do you have a bit of an understanding of the numbers of Australians who served in Russia following the armistice?
The numbers, the figures I quoted, there is a multitude of books. Well, not a multitude, no, that's not true. There's various different sources you can go to looking at the numbers of men that served. What's interesting is the number appears to be reducing in more recent books of how many we now believe served. So we get these figures of around about 500, 300 to 500. So it's very broad even then. 300 to 500 people expressing an interest in joining the the British effort up in Russia, leaving the AIF. But once we start breaking it down, there appears to be the figures are far, far less that actually served, that actually went to Russia and actually served. So I've looked at multiple books and I've used a kind of a generic figure, but I'll leave it up to you guys to do a little bit more research and see what you think. That's the best estimate that I have there.
Thank you, Pete. So we'll bring this to a close. Our questions are now finishing. I think having this conference in the week where Remembrance Day is particularly poignant. I think often what I do here with the narrative around Remembrance Day is what it means to each person. You know, remembrance is quite a personal thing, and a lot of people do have a look at these stories from many different lenses. So we really appreciate you sharing these 7 stories with us today and providing some information and answering those questions. I apologise, I have a fly buzzing around my head right now. He's also saying thank you and passing on, but thank you, Pete. We do really appreciate your time and your enthusiasm in sharing these important stories. I think the final tragedies, you know, the tragedy of war, the tragedy that surrounded so much of it, and those, you know, the war didn't end on, even though the guns fell silent on Armistice, the war still continued to take lives for a long period after that. So thank you everybody for joining and for participating in the question and answer chat. This does conclude the conference now. In the next couple of days, you will receive a link to be able to view this and share this on YouTube platform. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.